It is a pleasure to welcome you to One Slot. Here, we seek African solutions to African problems. Now, for a continent made up of 54 countries and 1.2 million people, it is worrying that only about 1% of our vaccine needs are made locally. Figures show that only 7 African countries have companies operating across the vaccine manufacturing value chain, and of these, only one, Senegal, exports a WHO pre-qualified vaccine. Most do not export at all. Now, with COVID-19, it became glaring how the uneven distribution of manufacturing and financing capabilities globally has led to an unequal distribution and access to vaccines, with African countries relying mostly on external suppliers and donations. Among efforts to address this is the pledge by the AU leaders on April 13, 2021 to increase the share of vaccine manufactured in Africa from 1% to a staggering 60% by 2040. Why is it so important for Africa to look away from vaccine donations? What are the key ingredients to kickstarting successful vaccine manufacturing in Africa? And is that time frame achievable? My guest today is widely recognized for her work as a global health practitioner. Professor Helen Rees has worked extensively with WHO and other institutions in the African region and is a chair of WHO's African Regional Immunization Technical Advisory Group. She has chaired the WHO's International Health Regulation Polio Emergency Committee since 2014 and is extensively involved in the regional and global response efforts to COVID-19, including vaccine development. Professor Rees, amongst her many roles, serves as a member of the WHO IHR Emergency Committee on COVID-19. Prof, it's a pleasure to welcome you on One Slot. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with the obvious question. Why is it so important for Africa to look away from donations and focus more on how we can grow our manufacturing capacity?
Well, I think if we thought it was important before, I think we now really understand why it was very important. A few years ago at the African Union, there was what signed by many health ministers from the region and some finance ministers, what was called the Addis Declaration. And in that declaration, health ministers committed themselves to ensuring high vaccine coverage. And there we weren't even thinking of COVID, we were thinking about childhood vaccines. But they committed themselves to high vaccine coverage for the region. But they also said that they wanted to look at vaccine manufacturing. But then the pause button got pressed again. And so not much was done about it until the reality of COVID-19 hit us. But I'm going to just wind back a little bit in this story because many people might have forgotten by now, but in 2009, we had another pandemic, which was a pandemic of influenza. And at the time, with the meetings in WHO, there was a real realization that once again, we were not going to get vaccines in time, that all the vaccines for that pandemic flu had been purchased by rich countries and were going to be distributed by rich countries. The World Health Organization, in response, set up a stockpile for those pandemic flu vaccines. But by the time they got to our region, it was months too late. And had that pandemic flu outbreak been worse in terms of killing people, then this continent would have been massively affected by lack of vaccines. But then we fast forward, we had the Addis Declaration where ministers committed to manufacturing, and then we suddenly get to COVID. And we once again say, we don't have manufacturing capacity. And although COVAX was set up by the World Health Organization and various other partners, UNICEF and CEPI and Gavi, they set up the COVAX facility to try and ensure that, in fact, low middle income countries around the world, including our region, got access to vaccines and were not left behind as it happened with pandemic flu. But unfortunately, although we have put the infrastructure in place, donations of money were slow to come in. And that meant that the ability to purchase vaccines was delayed. And by the time COVAX was able to purchase vaccines, we'd seen this huge stockpiling of vaccines amongst rich countries. So we've learned many lessons. But one of them is clearly that we do need to produce our own vaccines in anticipation not only of future emergencies, but to sustain our growing population and our growing population of children on our continent.
There are so many issues when it comes to, taking that leap to manufacture, which you know. But before we proceed with this conversation, let's quickly take a soundbite from the Stevie Masiyiwa. I'm not exactly sure if I got that name correctly, but he is the African Union envoy for COVID-19 response at the World Health Organization. Let's take a listen.
We want to buy vaccines. We're not asking for donations. You can donate to us if you so wish, but our basis is not a donation. That means we want access to purchase.
Okay, so on the one hand, we don't want to depend on donations. We want to buy if we go by that. But isn't that still a problem? We will be at the whims and caprices of those who manufacture this?
Well, there are several things in what was said there. I think that waiting for donations means that you're at the bottom of the dripping tap, and everything else will be taken first for people who want it before they will consider you. So donations per se, if we're completely reliant on that, is clearly not the way to go. And I think the whole world would agree with that. This is not a healthy situation. So what we need to be able to do is to access funds that are required, and then to be able to not be the last in the line when it comes to ordering the vaccines. The kinds of things that we're at the moment, and the World Health Organization is also opposing this, as is the African CDC, we're saying, look, it's not appropriate for rich countries to be talking about booster doses for their whole population or expanding doses to the smallest of children for whole populations, when the African region has only covered 2.5% of its entire population with vaccines. If we want to break this pandemic, you don't break it in one country or two countries or one continent. You have to break it globally. If we're going to break it globally, what we need to do is to get vaccine access as quickly as possible and as widely as possible to as many people as possible. That is what is going to ultimately stop the widespread transmission of the virus. But it's also going to stop what we're seeing, which is a big challenge, which is the changing of the virus with variants, which are becoming more resistant to vaccines. So our appeal is, let's get vaccines to everyone first, and then we start to look for the additional benefits that might come from boosters. But first and foremost, we must get coverage, and particularly for our region.
When we talk about transitioning to getting to the level of self-sufficiency or manufacturing, let's not say self-sufficiency yet, to the level of being able to manufacture a product, experts suggest that kickstarting a successful campaign requires certain steps, and you've highlighted a few of them. One is the financial need. Africa is known not to have so much when it comes to, investing in the things like this, considering the transient nature that it, as it were. But then again, one wonders, how can we now do the transition? How can we begin the process of actually getting started? What would be the right steps to start with?
Well, you've already highlighted one by saying, what have we got already? And we do have facilities in North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, as small as they are and limited in what they're doing. But we do have facilities that have the basis on which you could grow vaccine manufacturing. The second thing is that we must be sensible in our ambitions. So we're not going to go from very little to something extraordinary in 1 year. To set up vaccine manufacturing takes a considerable amount of time and expertise. So if we want to do this, we are going to have to build on what we've got. Secondly, it's going to be beneficial if the manufacturing hubs that we start to develop can focus on particular technologies in the first instance, so that they will develop the expertise for particular vaccine technologies. And then once we've done that, we're also going to have to look at our capacity to test new vaccines. The one thing that we do have in our region is really some very, very good sites, centers of excellence for clinical trial development. We've developed those for reasons of malaria and TB and HIV. And we really have some excellent clinical scientists who can do these tests. So we must attach those trial sites and those academics to manufacturing hubs as well, so that the vaccines that are developed can be properly clinically evaluated, backed up by a very strong laboratory system. So there are a lot of steps that are involved here, and it does involve expertise. So we will need to be able to grow the expertise, homegrown expertise, with the assistance, I'm quite sure, of international colleagues, so that we can actually develop and produce our own vaccines.
Are there any efforts at the moment towards training? Because at some point we heard this patent issue, they're not releasing it. So this training that we are going to get, is it on manufacturing or the vaccine production in itself? I'm a bit confused when we talk about, training these people. Could you explain that?
Yes, and there are different components when we think about developing vaccines. So the first component is, do we have really excellent laboratory scientists who can work on a particular disease? So if we take something that you would be familiar with, like Lassa fever, do we have excellent scientists who've specialized in looking at Lassa as an infectious disease? Because that would be the starting point. We need to understand what is the disease we're trying to tackle, what is what we call the pathogen, the virus or the bacteria that we're wanting to address, and what is the best way to make a vaccine that can then be subsequently tested first in the laboratory, then in animal studies, and then to move into clinical studies. So we need the laboratory scientists, and we need also the clinical scientists. But in addition to that, if we then move into the manufacturing space, we need the scientists to understand what it takes to manufacture a vaccine. It's complicated to manufacture vaccines, and not all vaccines are the same. The technologies are really quite different, and some of them are brand new. So we need to have the scientists who understand how you manufacture, how you ensure sustained quality of manufacture of that vaccine, because the quality of a vaccine is absolutely critical and essential for two reasons. One is that unless it contains the right amount of what we call the antigen, and it's constructed in the way that we want it constructed, it's like a recipe. Unless that is done really well and really carefully, there's a risk that the vaccine won't work as we want it to work, and there's a safety risk. So there's a science behind manufacturing as well. And then in addition to all of those categories of scientists in developing the vaccine, manufacturing the vaccine, we would then need to have the scientists who are able to evaluate what's happening with a particular infection. Take Lassa. Are there cases of infection occurring? Is it spreading? Is it spreading in a localized region? Is it spreading beyond borders and into other countries? And do we anticipate, with the sort of spread that we see with this disease or that disease, that it could spread even further? We've had the recent experience of the Ebola outbreak, where we know that in West Africa, it spread particularly then to 3 different West African countries. More recently, we've had an extensive outbreak of Ebola in the DRC, and that was contained to 1 country. But that's another category of scientists who detect in the laboratory whether there is an infection and an outbreak and what it is, and then look at the community and are able to describe how extensive that outbreak is. So you can see there are a lot of scientists all the way along the line that are required to both manufacture and develop vaccines, but to also understand how to evaluate them and how to use them in a particular context of an outbreak.
All right, before we go to the time frame that was suggested by the AU, let me quickly ask, is this effort going to be a regional thing, or are individual countries governments going to have some sort of arrangement? How do you see this working on a regional level?
I would say, in my experience, I feel that the region is really starting to build regional solidarity and the regional understanding that, we have problems in our region that are very different, for example, say if you're in the Asian region or if you're in Australasia. We have problems that are specific to our region and some that are specific to the specific areas of a region. The West Africa is very different in terms of its profile of disease, for example, to Southern Africa. So in terms of are we going to get a collective effort and is this appropriate? I would say yes. I also work in the regulatory field with drug regulation. What I've seen in that field in the last certainly 15 years is that there's a huge effort to bring African drug regulators together so that we can be more efficient and that we can actually support more rapidly clinical trial approvals, registration of all drugs and vaccines, and we can be sharing information with each other. That really is happening, and there is now an initiative to have a regulatory authority for the region. I see that the same thing is now happening with manufacturing. There are ambitious ideas, as you say, to have manufacturing hubs in the West, Central, East, Southern African regions, and people coming together to share that technology. Those hubs, though, the idea would also be that they would also train other people in neighboring countries and beyond, so that the idea of technology being able to be shared becomes a reality. So I'm very optimistic. As I said, based on my experience, I think the regulatory side is further advanced. We are doing it with drug regulation. I'm quite optimistic that we can do this with manufacturing.
All right, now, let's go on a short break. When we come back, I'd like to look at the capacity that we do have and if it's moving us towards the goal of self-sufficiency. Do stay with us. Thank you for staying with us. I understand we have less than 4 minutes on the program, so I'll just quickly ask this one. I did mention the question about capacity. There are arguments, let me just read it the way I wrote it here, that vaccine manufacturing is oriented towards fill and finish capacity at the expense of vaccine substance manufacturing and technology transfer. What do you say to that? Is that pushing us closer? Or what's your thinking on it?
So fill and finish is when you've got a sort of the ready-made vaccine and you literally do that. You take the product and you put it into the vials. And we do have some capacity for that. And in a sense, that's some of the easiest capacity to develop. And I think many of the sites that we're looking at will start with that capacity. We've already seen that happening with COVID vaccines, for example, at the Aspen plant in South Africa. But what we want to be able to do is to develop our own vaccines, novel vaccines for some of the pathogens that we have, some of the diseases we have, for which there are currently no good vaccines. We want to be able to work on things like better TB vaccines. We want an HIV vaccine for our region. So certainly we do need the basic science to start to be innovative in finding the original vaccine solution that then will be moved through to a manufacturing capacity.
All right. I'm sorry to interrupt. In the interest of time, I really need us to capture this part of the conversation. I understand there is an inaugural conference on public health in Africa slated for December. The continent has long struggled to strengthen its health systems. How will this conference be different from all the other conferences that we've had?
This is going to be the first African-led, it's led by the African CDC and the African Union, but it has all of the big regional role players. Many countries are supporting it and many, many African academics. This is going to be an African-led conference on public health. It'll be annual, we are hoping, and the first conference is going to focus on COVID-19, not just because we want to look at this as a disease and a virus, but because we want to say, what are the lessons that can be learned? What have we learned in terms of our needs for strengthening emergency responses, for strengthening our surveillance in the region, for strengthening our health services, for strengthening community engagement? So this is going to be a first. and it's open for registration now. I would encourage people to go online and have a look. But it is going to be a first African-led public health conference, and it is going to look very strongly at how we become more autonomous as a region and start to solve our own problems.
All right, Professor Helen Rees, thank you so much. I have so many questions, but we are constrained for time. Thank you for your thoughts today.
Thank you, Felicity.
All right, transitioning from vaccine dependency to homegrown capacity for manufacturing and distribution, like the Prof has said, it's not going to be an easy task, but as suggested, with sustained cooperation between African governments, the private sector and other stakeholders acting on a regional and continental basis, as well as supported by global bodies and partners, this task is achievable. And who knows, we just might surpass the 60% target set by the AU for 2040. This task is one that must be done, for even as we march towards the end of the COVID-19, we must prepare for the next pandemic, which is said to be a matter of when and not if. As always, I want to say thank you very much for your kind attention on the program. Until next week, bye for now.